Hello everybody, I am Dr. Kashey, your host, and my door is open. But I have a super neat microphone, so I think you can still hear me. Excuse me everybody. Welcome back to the video series on processed foods. This is going to be a little more philosophical on the philosophical side of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about public policy in terms of like laws and rules and regulations and stuff like that I find actually pretty interesting when you try and combine it with science. And as a biochemist, okay, I'm by training, I'm reductionist. I'm trained to be a reductionist, and the Oxford Dictionary defines reductionist as a person who analyzes and describes a complex phenomenon in terms of its simple or fundamental constituents. Makes sense, right? At least it does to me, but like I said, I am biased. I've been programmed and indoctrinated. Now, there's a growing public opinion that's rallying against science and scientists and reductionism and reductionist principles. And out of context, people look down on reductionism, what I just described, which makes sense when I explain it that way, right? But hear me out. Why? Because public common sense dictates a holistic approach to solving public health problems. And holistic is one of those words where everyone nods and agrees, but doesn't really know what it means with a practical implication. And this is really an anti-scientific sentiment that's disguised as emotionally charged propaganda or sayings like, treat the patient, not the symptom, right? Which sounds amazing, makes perfect sense. It even sounds like common sense, right? But it's a completely meaningless slogan, and it gives no direction. It only serves to hurt the process that actually leads to systematic improvements in health. At least healthcare processes and things like that in terms of treatment. Hell, even the holistic health practitioners, so-called holistic health practitioners, they break things up into components, but they're typically more related to lifestyle, right? Sleep, nutrition, exercise, smoking, drinking, stress reduction, healthy relationships, things like that, which are all amazing things to improve in your life and do have a direct impact on health, but even those are explicit categories of study, all with their own minutiae, which I think is kind of ironic, okay? And that's not how science works. It's not how common sense comes to be. It is only after you break something into its component parts that you can add it up together to call what we now call common sense, okay? For instance, it's common sense we get vitamins and minerals, right? People quickly forget, or maybe never even knew, that the discovery of vital nutrients was the result of reductionist processes, right? Scientific style experiments, accidental or otherwise, okay? And a seldom spoken about assumption about nutritional reductionism is that foods are the sum of their nutrient parts, which is kind of like saying, so long as you get all the vitamins, minerals, nutrients you need, then the exact foods you eat don't matter as long as you're covering those bases, okay? And opponents of that sort of thinking describe nutritionism or nutritional reductionism as a reductive focus on the nutrient composition of foods as a means of understanding their healthfulness, as well as a reductive interpretation of these role of these nutrients in bodily health. But basically caring more about how whole foods interact with the whole organism, okay? Which is whole foods matter more than the components of the food. That is the critique, essentially. And that sounds warm and fuzzy, right? Totally. And as a scientist, I kind of like the idea of nutritional reductionism. Ironically, for the very reasons people don't like it. I want to break something apart and determine the relative importance of all the little subcomponents. That's exciting to me and helps us learn things. And scientists have focused for a long time on the nutrient composition of foods, and it's been quite productive, okay? The discovery and implications of protein and carbohydrate and fat and minerals and vitamins and farming methods. That stuff's kind of a big deal if you ask me. It's like the backbone of human civilization and stuff, all right? In the current way the scientific method is applied, it's impossible to study biological systems in their entirety, which is why there's so much magic and humdrum, flim-flam, hoogly-boogly surrounding it, because you must account for all the variables and then piece everything back together. Poking around, you'll find that public health recommendations are kind of regressing a little bit. And in the context that they're kind of downplaying the role of nutrients in human health now. And there's a trend to provide guidance based on a holistic food-based approach instead, which sounds good on paper, I guess, right? Food and behavior recommendations versus nutrient recommendations, right? And there is a time and a place for that. But as a scientist, I'm not sure I can get behind that sort of public health policy. Now, public health education, on the other hand, completely different monster. That makes the most sense, bar none. Okay? Now, a Brazilian scientist named Carlos Monteiro, he said, I think this is a quote, maybe I'm paraphrasing, okay, foods formulated from industrial ingredients contain little or no intact foods, and by their very nature are unhealthy, and they should be grouped together and avoided. Woo! So this is saying anything that's even remotely processed, okay, is poisonous, okay, is what this sounds like to me, which I think is kind of extreme. Okay, one that a lot of people may actually agree with at face value, and it has even formed the basis of some of Brazil's dietary guidelines, amazingly enough. And the basis of these nutrition recommendations came from classifying foods based on the extent of how much a food is processed and the purpose that the food is processed, and ignoring, for the most part, the nutritional content. And although I can read between the lines, as a scientist, it seems like a strange way to generate national nutrition guidelines. The basic idea behind this is that you can't take a whole food and reproduce the same sort of health benefits by matching the nutrient compounds in a formulated food. Now, is most junk food processed? Hell yes, it is. Is processed food junk? Hell no. Okay, and an interesting thing that I think proponents of a whole food only nutrient guideline, something ironic about it to me is that they think of processed food as a static, unchanging thing, which is the exact opposite, and lumping them all together in a bad category as if somehow you can't reformulate or improve a product over time to match standards. Okay, and I see the policy implications for this. It's probably meant to keep industrial goofballs from taking advantage of loopholes and creating foods that meet public policy guidelines, in essence, purposefully processing a food that may take it out of the currently defined category of processed food, which wouldn't surprise me at all, and frankly, I would probably try to do the same thing because that's a fun game. That's neither here nor there. But that's their focus. It's on processing. And this is far different philosophically than creating nutrition policy. For instance, even if you improve the nutrient profile of that food substantially, it would still be classified as an ultra-processed food, okay? And I think that a lot of people may see that as a benefit of the system, and as a scientist concerned for public health, I actually kind of see that as a flaw. The idea that something that we do to food in the process of creating convenient, shelf-stable, inexpensive, tasty things, which I am totally pro all of those things, is somehow disrupting something about the foods and leading to have negative consequences on our health. And there are some countries outside the US and even some activists inside or lobbyists inside of the US that are kind of proposing like a skull and crossbone label on food products based off of their salt, sugar, and fat content. And I discussed a little bit earlier that Kevin Hall has taken that proof of concept that if you match those variables, it doesn't have an impact on how much of that food you consume, interestingly enough. Now, you still see substantial energy intake differentials, like people who eat 100% ultra-processed foods eat more, but we still don't know exactly why yet. There's a lot of potential hypotheses that underlie those differences, but I have other content in the previous videos discussing that, okay? So some other key questions are, essentially, can an ultra-processed food be reformulated to avoid the effects on calorie intake and weight gain and subsequent health implications? Or on the other side of the same coin, can and will companies remanufacture the way they create foods to make them fit into an unprocessed category due to language loopholes in the policy? All right, gaming the system by basically designing their products to meet whatever nutrient-specific guidelines there might be, whereas the products themselves might still be unhealthy, which is an interesting thing to consider and a fun game to play. Although, you know what I'm trying to say. And the example that was pointed out to me recently is the idea of, I think it's called a walking taco. I think Kevin Hall talked about this too, which is like a Dorito thing that kids are eating now, or did eat a little while ago, which meet healthy, hungry-free Kids Act guidelines, which are like, okay, meet these nutrient requirements for a meal, right? But it's still, everybody would still consider it a junk food by looking at it, but it still meets the nutrient requirements by the government standards. And these are the sorts of things that scientists and policymakers and manufacturers kind of all have to come to an agreement on. And it's possible a whole foods only categorization system would avoid that sort of stuff. I think it would. But there are other things to consider here because the policy implications are not always clear. And there's a lot of epidemiological evidence linking junk food to negative health. Like, okay, by and large, a lot of people who eat all of this stuff tend to get heart disease or whatever. Like, there's a lot of evidence that links junk food to stuff like that. But these products are convenient, they're tasty, and they're cheap. And microbiologically, they're safe. Like you're not gonna get sick and die if you eat it, not immediately, right? It's a slow, painful death, as it were. And generally speaking, those are good properties. They really are, okay? So take a different perspective for a moment here. Ultra-processed food contributes a huge fraction of habitual, like daily dietary calories and nutrients to people that live in the US and in other countries. Something like more than half, like 60% of the calories in the US are coming from ultra-processed foods. And that might be scary to a lot of people. But it's also important to realize that it's important that if you're gonna think about like taxing or regulating ultra-processed foods, which is something that's being discussed at the policy level, right? Like the fat tax, sugar tax, things like that, like making these foods more expensive. The issue is that, like making it more expensive so people buy less of them essentially, and then hopefully that has a positive impact on health. The problem is people who are eating the most of these products, they're on the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum. And to put this in perspective, regulating and taxing those foods is a tax on the poor. It's a tax on the poor. And without giving some sort of guidance and support to slowly but surely shift diets away from those sorts of foods, it can be a disaster if one day a law was passed, well, all of a sudden now all the food I eat is twice as expensive when I already don't have enough money to go around. And so that's something that really needs to be considered before people make sweeping generalizations about, you know, what people should and shouldn't eat, because there are other things to consider. And given right now that preparing meals from unprocessed foods and culinary ingredients, it takes more time, it takes more energy, it takes more skill, it takes more equipment to do these things safely and effectively. It takes like 50% more time to make an unprocessed meal or more compared to an ultra-processed meal. Not to mention the tools and the skills and the know-how, okay? And I think that's important to recognize. And if so, taxing those things, taxing the ultra-processed foods, it's gonna hurt the people that we need to help the most, just in different ways. And so I think it disproportionately affects people with a lower socioeconomic status. And to keep things in perspective, is most junk food processed? Hell yeah, it is. All right, is processed food junk? Hell no, it ain't. Okay? The focus shouldn't be, is processed food good or bad? The focus needs to be, why do we process food? And what are the implications? And how does it end up helping or hurting us? And how can we help evolve our system over time to garner a more healthy population in the long run?